Good morning. Good morning, everyone. What do you call a belt of watches? A waste of time. I feel like it's Monday morning. We got to start with a joke. It's a dad joke. I think my husband heard that 5 times this morning, and so I had to try it on some other folks. Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to our event this morning. Also, we have folks joining us online virtually. Welcome to them as well. A beautiful Monday morning here in Denver, Colorado, and I'm thrilled to see a really good room here. Hopefully you're enjoying breakfast. I'm Kristen Eulenbrock. I lead our Institute for Science and Policy. We are a project here at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And in partnership with Will, sitting down there at the end, the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. I got it. He changed his name somewhat recently. We've been bringing you this series on climate interventions. This is part 2, where we're going to be talking about carbon removal at scale. Part 1 was last month, and we talked about solar radiation management. There's a video available if you missed that and you want to watch that. And then we'll have a part 3 next month at the end of July. Date is getting worked out right now, where we're going to be talking about carbon dioxide removal in Colorado specifically. I see 2/3 of my panel is here for next month already. And it'll have a very strong Colorado focus, where today we're going to have a little bit of that broader lens, talking about carbon dioxide removal. Our discussions are really broad-ranging. This is a conversation that we'll be having. We're going to talk around issues around policy. We're going to talk about technology. We're going to talk about ethics, uncertainty, governance, all of these really sticky questions when we're talking about these issues. As a tool and as a pathways, we think about removing carbon dioxide to try to help solve for climate change, which we need to do because we know we're not on the pathways to meet some pretty critical targets and thresholds. So let me introduce this lovely panel sitting up here. We have directly here to my right, we have Freya Chay, and I'm going to read so I make sure I don't mess up their titles. Program lead at CarbonPlan. CarbonPlan is a nonprofit that analyzes climate solutions based on best available science and data. Thank you for being here, Freya. Next to Freya is Alicia Karspeck. Her and I worked together many, many years ago at IncarUcar, but now she's the co-founder and chief technology officer for Seaworthy, which is building software. It's a nonprofit too, correct? That builds software that supports multi-scale oceanographic modeling and data integration for quantifying the efficacy and ecological impacts of ocean-based CDR. I took that from the website. It's a mouthful. And then we have Celina Scott-Buechler. Celina is amazing. She's finishing her joint PhD JD right now at Stanford, while also working full-time, and she's had an amazing career thus far. But just that is super impressive. She's a senior resident fellow for climate innovation for Data for Progress. That's a think tank and polling firm. And last but definitely not least is my colleague sitting down there at the end, Will Burns, who is definitely a leader in the carbon dioxide removal conversations in space. And he's been partnering with me to help bring this series together, think through the topics, the speakers, and all that great stuff. He's the co-director of the Institute for Responsible Carbon Removal. It's easier if I read it. They're located at American University, also as a visiting professor at Northwestern right now, too. Okay, so I'm going to start. Will, why don't you start for me for the start of the conversation, and tell me a little bit like why do we do CDR? Why?
Yeah. So I view it as 4 potential rationale for why we would try to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The first of them is in the short term. What we're trying to do is buy time while we decarbonize the world's economy. And what we know is that as concentrations of CO2 grow in the atmosphere, temperatures increase. And one of the things that we're worried about is passing critical thresholds, 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, where we start to see really serious impacts in terms of those temperatures, and in some cases potentially irreversible impacts. And so if we can draw some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as we simultaneously in job 1 reduce our emissions, we may be able to extend the period that we have before we would pass those critical thresholds. So that's a short-term objective. The medium-term objective is by the time we get to the middle of the century, the primary international climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, says that we should be aiming for what we call net zero emissions, right? Which is to balance what residual emissions we have at that point with things that take carbon dioxide out of the air, right, and get to net zero. And to do that, we're likely to need substantial amounts of carbon removal because we're likely, even in that time, still to have large amounts of emissions from sectors that are hard to reduce those emissions in, such as aviation and steel and concrete. In the longer term, a lot of scientists believe that we don't want to leave concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere where they are now, past 420 parts per million, that we ultimately want to return back to a time where the climate was deemed to be safer, perhaps 350 parts per million, 300 parts per million. And so what we want to do is continue to draw CO2 out of the atmosphere at that point in what's called a net negative scenario. And then the last rationale is what we call the overshoot scenario. Let's say we don't meet our temperature targets. We're not going to. Let's say that happens. We're going to start seeing serious negative manifestations from that. We can use carbon removal to draw ourselves down back below those temperature thresholds, right? It doesn't mean we won't see serious and maybe irreversible impacts, but we may be able to ameliorate in the long term the impacts that would occur if temperatures stayed at those levels for centuries beyond this.
Great. Any other whys we should be doing this? We'll cover them all. Yeah, everything's on. Go.
I love that framing of the different roles, and would also offer just the simplest boiled down version, which is because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere essentially forever when we emit it, to stabilize temperatures globally, to stop warming, any carbon we put in, we have to take back out.
I'll add one point to this, which is really about not just why do we do CDR, but why do we need to do it right now? And that has to do with, and I'm going to speak a little bit to this, is that the act of doing carbon dioxide removal is essentially, in a lot of cases, an industrial process or process that involves engineering and research. And so there's a lot of urgency just to start learning how to do carbon dioxide removal at scale now, even if we don't expect to actually do large-scale deployment for many, many years.
Okay, I'm going to let the audience know, too, that you can ask us questions. And so there's, I think, a QR code on the table. There could be on the slide. I can't see what's on the slides. That if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions. You can upvote other questions, make comments. I'll try to incorporate them into our discussion as we go along, so I encourage you to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about the pathways. And we'll come back to this QR code. It's on your table, too, if you need it. But Alicia, could you talk to us about some of these major pathways? And I know you can't see it. If you want to stand up, yeah, go and look. We're going to talk about what are we talking about here when we talk about carbon dioxide removal.
Yeah, so I hope you guys can see this. If not, I'll walk you through it real quick. You know, so a lot of times when we talk about carbon dioxide removal, or you hear that, there's a lot of sort of abstraction, like what exactly is this and what are we talking about? So you'll hear this term pathways come up quite a bit in this discussion. And all that really means is the different types of methodologies that we think of to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So I want to just show you just a couple of what we call the different sort of taxonomies or categories of types of carbon dioxide removal. And you'll see there's a really, really broad range. So the two ones that you'll hear a lot is one is called conventional carbon dioxide removal. So these are the types of carbon dioxide removals that are currently enacted right now. So there is carbon dioxide removal happening right now in the form of afforestation and reforestation processes. In terms of having soil carbon being stored through improved agricultural processes. And what we see is that globally there's about 2 gigatons of carbon removal that are happening right now through those conventional methods. A gigaton is 1 billion tons. Just to put that into scale, when Will was talking about our targets for mid-century, that's around 10 gigatons, right? So we're not where we need to be right now. So these are called conventional CDR. They're really amazing methods. They're sort of related to the agricultural sector. They do have some challenges, which has to do with this concept of durability, which means that it's not clear how long that carbon remains actually stored and away from the atmosphere. That's a whole conversation in of itself that I won't get into. There is another whole class that's called novel or durable carbon dioxide removals. You can think of these as sort of a next generation or types of carbon dioxide removal, which are not as mature in terms of their readiness level. And I'm just going to name a few of them here because the terms will come up. You don't have to remember them all, but just so you're familiar with these terms. You'll hear terms like biochar, so that just has to do with creating kind of a charcoal-like product that's related to biomass, that's stable. Enhanced rock weathering, so this has to do with just enhancing the natural process of weathering and pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have something called direct air capture. Sometimes it's called DAC. You'll hear that term. That's something that's a very industrial process where you're removing CO2 directly from the air. Ocean fertilization. You may have heard ocean or iron fertilization. So this has to do with this idea of that we actually spur biomass growth in the ocean, and that takes up more CO2. We have things like ocean alkalinity enhancement, and actually something called direct ocean capture. So a whole set of here which we think are very durable, but are actually sort of novel, and we're just working through collectively some of those technologies. So I just want to mention a couple of different various taxonomies that people think of. So I just gave you one taxonomy, which is conventional versus novel and durable. You'll also hear people talking about these categories of biotic and abiotic. So biotic are any carbon removal processes which in some way evoke kind of natural ecosystems or biological processes. So an example of that is ocean iron fertilization. And we have abiotic approaches, which are mostly mostly geochemical. So these are things like ocean alkalinity enhancement or enhanced rock weathering or even direct air capture. People often categorize these in terms of natural and technological. So you'll hear people say things like nature-based solutions versus technological solutions. I would just point out there's actually a pretty big gray area, right? So all of these taxonomies are things people are still considering and thinking through. And then of course we have this taxonomy of land-based versus ocean-based. These are all different ways that people categorize these different pathways. And so just to finalize, I want to just show you a little bit of what a CDR actually look like in practice. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, there's not actually a lot of CDR going on outside of conventional CDR right now, but we do have some pilot projects for a lot of these different methods. And so I just wanted to show you what this actually looks like in practice, right? We have actual afforestation and reforestation happening, agricultural management that's actively happening right now. There are pilot projects around enhanced rock weathering, which actually happen on agricultural fields as well. Biochar is actually a known technology that's happening all the time. What's new is thinking about that in terms of carbon removal. We have new companies working in direct ocean capture, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and this is direct air capture. So this is what it actually looks like in practice.
Thank you, Alicia. We talked a little bit about like the idea of actually giving you some slides for that. Anything else you all would add about the viability and durability of these types of different nature-based and technology-based solutions?
Yeah, I'll start off here. So I think we often talk about conventional CDR as sort of ready to go. And I want to distinguish from something that we can implement and something that we can do in a way such that it amounts to measurable carbon removal. I think there's often this idea that we can, plant trees and that will count towards CDR. There is the challenge that I'm sure we'll talk about later in this panel of monitoring, reporting, and verification. And so I'm a social scientist. I come from a natural science background, but I'm now a social scientist. And a technology or a pathway is usually thought of as the implementation stage. And I want to challenge us and think that policy in general should be challenged more to think about a technology or a pathway as start to finish. So implementation through to crediting. And so where I slightly disagree with the first image or the first figure that was put up on the screen of the state of CDR, which is a great report. I highly recommend reading it. It just came out, has a lot of exciting findings, but that it sort of presents these conventional CDR approaches as ready to go. And they are in a stage of experimentation. We need new ways of monitoring how much these new systems are removing. There are questions about additionality, which is to say, how do we know that these actions that we're taking wouldn't have been taken anyway, and how are we contributing to additional tons of CO2 being removed from the atmosphere? And so we'll be talking about scaling CDR, and I think often that that scaling or that sort of experimentation tends to be placed on the technological rather than the sort of land-based pathways. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to figure out all of these various pathways such that they are scalable and across kind of both categories.
Freya, we, I think, had talked about this. There's this concept when people hear nature-based that they just automatically assume good versus technology. Not saying bad, but just when they hear the word nature, there's an assumption that there's something good about that. How do you speak about that?
Yeah, it's so interesting. So of the taxonomies that you shared, I find nature-based versus technologically based one of the least useful. Is speeding up rock weathering less natural than a plantation forest? Like, arguably, no. We are humans intervening in complex systems. And I think it carries all of this value, glow, the word nature. But I think it's often not very helpful for us thinking about what makes sense where. Actually, one of the more useful taxonomies that I find is this taxonomy around durability. So when you do the action and it removes carbon, how long do you expect that carbon to be removed? I think that's really, really important for our thinking, just based on the science. So we started out, Will gave us a really great introduction. Again, when we burn CO2, it impacts warming for millennia. Forests are fantastic. Soils are fantastic. Removing carbon via these methods does not necessarily mean we are taking care of a fossil emission, because the liability we have created by burning fossil fuels lasts way longer than we can promise to protect forests or soil carbon. So I really lean on that durability taxonomy, not to pass a value judgment about what is worth doing or not, but to think about how different technologies or pathways can fit into our big picture climate goals and planning.
I think that's a great point. I want to just add in here something that may not be clear to everyone here, is that there is really a lot of active academic research happening into all of these pathways. So whenever you're hearing, again, terms like nature-based, what you're thinking about, and we're thinking about doing an intervention into the natural system, maybe to speed up natural process of carbon dioxide removal. Think about actually invoking the entire discipline of folks who work in the Earth system science and climate science world already. So when we think about things like any sort of pathway around an ocean-based pathway, we need things like oceanographers and also ocean modelers who are actively thinking about the ocean carbon cycle and actively enhancing and pushing forward that research right now. When we think about enhanced rock weathering and soil carbon, these are things where we are needing this entire discipline of folks who work in terrestrial and land modeling, who work in agricultural sciences. So just remember, these are not just companies pushing this forward. These are not just policy objectives. These are entire groups and disciplines of scientists who are coming along on this journey of helping us understand what it means to do these types of interventions in the natural world.
Everything comes with some level of trade-off with it, right? This is the world we live in. Environmental concerns, both benefits and trade-offs are part of these. What are some big ones that you all are hearing discussed and debated, researched, and evaluated when it comes to some of those environmental risks and trade-offs that we have to take into account? Will, go ahead.
Well, we've already heard the idea that nature-based is not necessarily an unalloyed good, right? And a part of it is the scale that you do it at and where you do it. So, for example, tree planting, right, which sounds like per se good, right? We like trees. We have other benefits from planting trees. But when we talk about using afforestation and reforestation at really large scales in terms of carbon removal, you start to get some clear trade-offs. For example, if a lot of the areas that we talk about being able to plant trees in are areas like prairie grasslands and savannas, and these are areas high in biodiversity, right? And there could be some clear trade-offs in terms of encroaching in those areas. A lot of times when we talk about tree planting, there's potentially large populations, including indigenous people, that rely on that land for their livelihoods, and they potentially could be expelled from that land as elitists in countries try to obtain carbon credits. When we plant huge amounts of trees, we can alter the hydrological regime in an area, right? We can require huge amounts of fertilizer that can result in nitrification, right? And so we have to, and if we plant plantation forests, right, again, and replace areas where we had a wide diversity of trees, again, we may undermine biodiversity, right? And so I think other speakers will talk about some of the other approaches, but I'd emphasize that when it comes to the nature-based solutions, it has a role in that goal of getting maybe to 10 billion tons by the middle of the century, maybe as much as 15 or 20 billion tons at the end of the century if we don't get our act together in terms of decarbonizing. But it's probably, it has to be part of a portfolio. Like any one of these approaches at really large scale is likely to prove unsustainable. But figuring out how you cobble all these together and govern them effectively and look at the trade-offs between them is part of the huge social science governance challenge that Celina was talking about.
Yeah, and I think that one of the other challenges in this field, we're obviously concerned about carbon dioxide, and for good reason. As Freya was saying, carbon dioxide will remain in the atmosphere for millennia. And also by sometimes monetizing that carbon unit, or at least prioritizing that carbon unit, we are falling into what I like to call kind of carbon dioxide myopia, which is to say that we're forgetting about other greenhouse gases that might be created in the process of removing that carbon dioxide. We might be privileging removing carbon dioxide over preservation of biodiversity. And usually when decision makers, be they a private company or a government, are making these decisions, it's not clear that we're trading off 1 unit of carbon dioxide for 1 unit of biodiversity. It is, we have, 1 unit of carbon dioxide with maybe a 25% risk of some harm to biodiversity. And we usually can't narrow it down to 25%. We think, it's within this kind of range. And where these individual actions are making these kinds of risk trade-offs in isolation of others, we don't have this kind of, general or sort of centralized planning around what risks we're willing to take as a society, but also what risks we're taking in each one of these decisions and how they add up, what cumulatively those risks then end up being. We are obviously facing a climate crisis. We are also facing a biodiversity crisis. We are also, in many parts of the world, both in the US, which is kind of where I think about policy most, but also internationally, facing equity crises. And so how do we sort of figure out all of these things together? And one example that I think a lot about is, the US is the largest cumulative emitter of CO2 in history. And that creates a responsibility, I think, this is a normative take, to remove carbon dioxide, not only so that we can net out our own emissions, but also so that we can contribute to the kind of net negative, but also shaving off the peak of 1.5, the overshoot of 1.5, all of these other things that we need to be doing collectively as a global society, so that the countries and the populations that have contributed least to the climate crisis are able to develop in ways that maybe aren't the most sustainable, but that allow them to meet the needs of their populations across some of these other crises that are intersecting with climate. At the same time, we face national equity crises. And so it is, one thing to say that the US should take up this mantle of removing excess carbon so that we can be a good global player, but we also need to be thinking about the site impacts of where those projects are going, what communities they're going in, and the kinds of participation and governance processes that we have around not just sort of those global risks of, say, biodiversity, but also local risks of, is it going to create the kinds of co-pollutants that affect human health, for example, and how do we decide that one community is going to take on that risk burden versus another? So I could talk about this for ages, but I'll leave it there.
I want to build on that and bring the other panel into this question from the audience about how do we make decisions around CDR implementation when we know actions needed now, but we know things are experimental, we know there's a ton of risk and trade-offs. How do you make a decision that doesn't lead to paralysis, right? How do you get past this paralysis stage? This is not an easy question, I'm sure, but I'd be curious.
I mean, I think my litmus test right now is, does this decision help us learn? If we are setting up just a deployment right now that doesn't help us learn and we are taking on these risks, I kind of think probably not worth it. So as policymakers, as CDR buyers, whether you're participating in a market, whether you're participating as a regulator, I think the question right now is, does this help us learn more about what works or doesn't work in ways that actually help us get toward knowing whether or not we will have the tool of gigaton scale carbon removal?
Okay, so let me, I agree, and this will be where I think we can do a little bit of agreeing and disagreeing with each other. So, my perspective is, and I'll just give you guys a little bit of background, is that, a lot of the early stage CDR that's happening, at least outside of the conventional markets, is being done by small scale startups. And so these are startups which tend to be venture capital backed. Their business models are actually around trying to remove carbon and then sell onto a voluntary credit market. So you've sort of Celina's been talking a little bit about accounting and MRV, and this is around this idea of actually doing enough quantification that you can actually sell credits on a voluntary carbon market. I think we'll talk about that in a bit. But I'm saying all that to point out that a lot of this early learning that's happening is happening by small companies who are probably, in many cases, not going to succeed, right? That's just the reality of early stage startups. And so it's a very bumpy road for them. And so when we talk about this kind of learning, we're not just talking about the scientific and technological learning that has to happen, but also what has to happen when you build a new industry from nothing, right? Which means that you have to learn how to operate within regulatory environments, how to operate when there aren't clear regulatory environments. You have to think about things like, do I have the right staff? Do we have collectively enough expertise in the right disciplines to build a new industry? So I think I agree around this concept of like we should do things around learning, but I actually think we should take a more holistic view of what that learning looks like, acknowledging that we are trying to build an industry here where there not is an existing industry.
And I might hop in there and say, I totally agree. I think one of the most interesting avenues for learning right now are real deployments. But we have to make sure those learnings don't stay behind business moats, that they aren't just behind closed doors. We have to figure out how to get that learning outside of a transaction, outside of a startup, and make sure it's available to the public, especially because most of these startups won't be around, probably.
So let's talk a little bit about the economics and funding for these things. What are we seeing as some of those economic drivers? You know, she talked about the startup world. Could you give us a little bit of landscape of what you're seeing through all these various technologies? And then I think we can broaden this quite broad into the market conversation.
Yeah, so as has been alluded to, right now a lot of the CDR deployment that is happening in the context of the voluntary carbon market. And essentially, this market is one in which mainly corporates are buying credits that represent a ton of carbon removal. And then they are using those credits to make claims to the public. Things like, my milk is carbon neutral. You've probably seen these marketing claims. And they're making that claim because the story is that by buying the carbon credit, they are enabling a new climate good to happen. So this is the context in which much carbon removal deployment is happening today, and it's been a really powerful tool. You've had really leading, forward-thinking buyers taking a position of being willing to pay quite a lot to support novel deployment that they think will help bring about carbon dioxide removal learning. Just to give you a sense of costs, you know, the Department of Energy has a program they're calling the Carbon Negative Shot. And their big dream goal is gigaton scale carbon removal. So that's billion tons per year at a cost of $100 per ton. That is a lot of money. And today, we are transacting around tons that are much more expensive than that. So direct air capture, which uses chemicals to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and then puts that carbon usually underground or into some other form of permanent storage, that's often on the order today of $500 to north of $1,000 a ton. Things like enhanced weathering, you're seeing maybe $200 to $500 a ton. Some things like biochar, which are less durable but more practiced, maybe a little cheaper than that. But we are not yet at the $100 a ton mark. Those prices reflect first-of-a-kind deployments. That's hard, and there's a lot of learning to do. But even if we hit that $100 a ton benchmark, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars a year to support this tool that we think we need.
I think in the longer term, we're going to need public mandates, and we're all going to have to pay to clean this up if this is going to happen, right? These markets are incredibly small. We don't have a social cost of carbon that really reflects the actual cost of carbon emissions, and as a consequence, we don't have the market signals that drive corporations and others to embrace carbon removal, especially if it's costing hundreds of dollars per ton, for example, right? And so our institute believes that in the longer term, if we're going to get to 10 billion, 15 billion tons, we're going to need obligations, legal obligations, right? It may be that ultimately we think of this as a utility model, right? We ultimately adopted that model for waste disposal, right? And we all pay for it, and it hopefully reduces the amount of waste that we produce as a consequence of those market signals. Similarly, we could have public carbon removal as a utility model in which we all pay for cleaning up the garbage that we've put into the atmosphere and benefited from putting that garbage into the atmosphere, or we could have obligations on corporations for every ton of carbon emissions, they pay for a ton of removal, right? But in my opinion, if we continue to rely on the kindness of strangers and voluntary carbon markets, it's always going to be so extremely modest in terms of what we ultimately get that carbon removal is not going to have a substantive impact in terms of climate.
Yes, I could not agree more.
Anything else on the incentive mandate conversation or market conversation you guys want to add? Looking at the two haven't spoke. Yeah.
Yeah, so I work in public opinion, and most people haven't heard of carbon dioxide removal, which is probably unsurprising. And when they do learn about it, there's general interest. Where that interest starts to go south is when they're told they have to pay for it. And as we are experimenting with the science, the physical and the natural science, we also need to be experimenting with the social science. And the thing that is much more popular than having the average taxpayer pay for carbon removal is to have companies that have historically emitted carbon dioxide to be responsible for a share of that historic emission. Certainly, current emissions, people seem to agree that seems fair. Where it gets a little murkier is when do we start the clock on when companies knew that their product was going to create this climate change problem that then the public would have to assume liability for? And how do we sort of negotiate that? And so I think ultimately this will have to be a challenge that is brought into the public realm. And also, I think when we're asking questions about sort of equity, the average person is looking at this waste management problem and is saying, well, I contributed some to it, but I didn't make billions of dollars off of it. And so, how are we thinking about companies not just being the kind strangers that step up to buy into this voluntary carbon market, but how do we actually think about what is just in terms of the allocation of costs of this, as we're talking about very expensive undertaking?
Let me just add on to that around just this concept of incentives, and just to point out, and I think it's obvious, but it's useful sometimes to step back in that, there are when we think about these different incentives that different sectors have for removing carbon. So if you're a corporate, your incentive might be actually one of optics and brand reputation, right? You want to, as Freya pointed out, be carbon negative. If you're, for example, something like a municipality or a government, you might actually be caring about the actual quantification overall towards climate goals, or maybe even towards being a good global steward. There's all sorts of number of incentives for doing this. One thing that all of these have in common is that we have to think really hard about how we actually quantify the amount of carbon removed, right? And I think we're going to get on a topic about monitoring, reporting, and verification, which is about this question not of this abstraction of whether a pathway can remove carbon, but how much does it actually remove? And it's useful to keep in mind that for every single one of these pathways, there actually remains kind of an open research space about how we actually do that quantification of the carbon removal. And this actually matters a lot, both in terms of whether we can have carbon markets that are credible, so this again speaks to that incentive, or whether or not we actually even understand our global carbon budget. So it sometimes comes as a surprise to people to learn that we really have quite a lot of uncertainty, even in terms of what our global carbon budget is. And so as we're learning how to actually do this accounting problem for individual projects, we're also learning about how to do better global accounting of greenhouse gases overall as well.
And a carbon budget, really briefly, is the amount of carbon that we could still emit before getting to these critical thresholds.
Thank you. Let's talk about verification, which is the tricky, sort of thing here that we've been alluding to. Give me some really good end of the spectrum where things we're really good at potentially verifying, and over here where we're really not good. Freya, do you want to start with that? And I would love others to chime in too.
Sure. So something like direct air capture, I think actually contains both ends of this spectrum, which is really interesting. So direct air capture, we can meter how much CO2 is coming out of a pipe from that facility. We can quantify that really well. We can meter how much CO2 goes underground into geologic storage. Questions we might have more uncertainty around is like, what does it mean for direct air capture to use a lot of energy, to require a lot of renewable energy? How should we account for that? How should we account for the impacts on the grid, the possibility that because the direct air capture facility is using that renewable energy, someone else doesn't get to? So that kind of system secondary effect type of question is really hard, and we're still figuring out how to do that, not only in direct air capture, but also in other climate technologies like hydrogen. Another on challenging end of the spectrum, we have mentioned a couple of pathways, like enhanced weathering or ocean-based pathways, which are often referred to as open system pathways. And that's because we do the first action, we spread rocks or we add alkalinity, but then we are relying on a complex system. We are relying on the ocean, we are relying on soils, we are relying on watersheds to remove carbon over large spaces and time. And that's just hard to observe. We can't observe it directly, and we can use tools, we can use models, we can use system observations to kind of bound our uncertainty, but those are hard quantification questions. And I think it's really interesting actually to tie this verification challenge back to the question of what kind of incentives are we setting up? If we are operating in a carbon market where somebody gets to buy that ton and claim that they have absolved themselves of a fossil emission, you want to be very, very, very sure that that ton actually represents something real and quantified. If instead you are operating in a space where you think carbon removal might have some important co-benefits, like maybe enhanced weathering is providing pH management benefits in agricultural systems, and you know that it's directionally right, you might be much more comfortable kind of holding significant uncertainty in the exact quantification. So marrying our ability to verify things with confidence to the correct incentive system to actually deploy technologies is a really important piece of this puzzle.
Okay. Anything else to that? Because I've got lots of questions here. Why don't we keep things moving? Okay. I want to bring in an audience question, which is, why not focus when we have limited resources on more proven source processes like energy efficiency for new and existing buildings, renewable sources of energy, storage, et cetera? When we are in a resource-constrained world, why don't we not do that?
I think the simple or not so simple answer is we waited so long to get our crap together that we now need to do both, and that's unfortunate, right? If back when I had hair in the 70s, we really started all of those things in earnest, we probably wouldn't be talking about any of these things now, right? Or solar radiation management and things of that nature, these aggressive interventions. But we didn't, right? And emissions, despite the fact that we put the Paris Agreement in place, emissions still continue to grow every year, about 1.2, 1.5%. And every year that happens, we need more carbon removal, right? And so we need to be simultaneously decarbonizing the world economy and utilizing carbon removal. Now, one thing one hopeful note about that is the more quickly we can decarbonize the economy, right, the less carbon removal that we'll need in the longer term, right? And so That always needs to be job one. We need to ensure that carbon removal is never touted as an alternative way to get to where we are, because it can't do it. We could not conceivably scale it at the level that would mean that we don't need to decarbonize, and it doesn't make the most sense from an economic perspective, right? But what all of the experts now tell us is that both all of the things that you were talking about in the question and some carbon removal will be critical if we're going to meet those short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals that I talked about before.
Just really briefly, I think, CDR is the new kid on the block, and so, it's raised a lot of hype. If we look at recent infrastructure packages, the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, there were large carve-outs for CDR, but the bulk of the climate funding still went to energy efficiency, renewable energy, things like that. And so I think often, we sort of see a lot about CDR because it is this new and exciting area. And it makes us think that priorities are shifting, and that isn't necessarily true. It is something that we have to keep an eye out for, because we certainly don't want CDR to take the place of any of these other things, but it hasn't yet, and I'm hopeful that that continues.
Yeah, just one more point on this is just to remind everyone that carbon dioxide removal doesn't really work unless you have lower carbon energy sources to actually power that. So Freya pointed out that there's this concept where we have to actually account for all greenhouse gas emissions through the entire process of carbon removal. And that process sometimes can be energy intensive, transportation intensive. So it's actually quite hard to get true net carbon dioxide removal unless you are also creating more low carbon energy sources and transportation sources at the same time. They have to go together.
This goes back a little bit to the public opinion polling, but what efforts are being made to get the public primed to have this baseline knowledge of CDR, so when policies, regulations, mandates, markets are ready, what efforts? Obviously, we're hosting one today, but I'm curious, what other efforts are underway to get public knowledge up there?
Yeah, I think one of the most, so when we talk about publics, there's sort of the national public, so folks who are, voting, going to the polls. And then there are the sort of local publics, who are the folks who are in the neighborhoods near the projects that are being deployed, or the farmers who are working on the fields where things are being deployed. And I think the first category of folks, the general public, the news media, especially several kind of climate outlets, has gotten much better about reporting on these things, about clarifying the differences between carbon dioxide removal and, say, point source carbon capture and storage, two terms that often got confused, carbon capture and storage being a filter that you add to an emission source to try and prevent some of that, some of those emissions from going into the atmosphere. And so I think there's been a lot of education of the educators, and that is, folks who are writing about this space. And then in terms of local publics, one of the things that I think has been, really effective is the single largest government investment in CDR to date, not only in the US, but globally, is the Direct Air Capture Hubs program. And so that is for these technological pathways that are large fans blowing air through a filter that catches that CO2 that then you can pump underground or turn into long-lived materials. And that program, I think really shrewdly, was placed under the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative. And so that is the initiative saying that as we are transitioning to this clean economy, 40% of the benefits should flow to the communities that have traditionally not seen those kinds of benefits. So either energy communities that have helped to power our economy and are now in this limbo as we're transitioning, or environmental justice communities that have borne the burden of pollution in their backyards without seeing benefits. And so under that program, any company that wants to get money from this $3.5 billion pot of funding needs to submit a community benefits plan. And that forces them to think about, how are we engaging the local communities? How are we thinking about this being mutually beneficial? There are flaws in the ways that that's going, but it is a huge, huge start to be tying funding to how are you educating, how are you also being educated by the communities that you're interacting with.
Anything else?
Yeah, I want to just add that, two points. So one is that what research has shown is that in terms of people coming along for this journey of understanding about CDR and developing their own viewpoints on that, some of the most trusted sources of that information are the scientific community. So these tend to be considered to be independent brokers of the information around carbon dioxide removal. They exist at universities, at national centers, et cetera. So part of this journey in terms of engagement and people sort of understanding about this process has also been happening within the academic sciences. So there has been a trend in the last 10, 20 years of more and more mainstream academic scientists who are climate scientists, again, soil scientists, et cetera, who are starting to engage with doing active fundamental research into carbon dioxide removal and sort of developing these scientific disciplines around that. And so that's a really important additional piece of helping kind of build out that sort of social acceptance and social just sort of engagement in the question of, is this something we want to move forward on? The second point I want to make is dealing with these questions is really thorny and takes time. So my experience has been, this is true for most scientists and most people that I interact with, is that people have to sit with this information about carbon dioxide removal and some of these really thorny questions about what that means for us, for a society, for a long time before actually coming to really clear viewpoints for themselves. So one of the things I sort of encourage you all as you're on this journey is to give yourself a lot of space to just spend time thinking about this, this potential space, because it's a really, really, really wild, in some ways, place that we've found ourselves.
That's awesome. I want each of you to address this one. We're getting close towards the end here, so I'm going to kind of move us into closing thoughts. So I have two, but the first one is, what's a misconception that you have come across that you feel like you have to address all the time, or that is a new one for you? And I would love each of you just to give me one. And obviously explain why it's a misconception.
So I think this one actually showed up in the way that we all talked about carbon removal today. We are imagining that we will use gigatons, maybe even 10 or 15 gigatons of carbon removal to stabilize global temperatures. That is a tremendous amount. It is just, it's like just hard to even conceptualize how much mass that is. And we often frame the conversation of carbon removal about how do we get to that number. But I think the much better question is, how quickly can we figure out whether or not we have this tool and at what scale, so we can change the rest of our planning?
Yeah, I think there's often conflation between preventing carbon dioxide emissions in some ways and removing them. And that gets really thorny in, land-based pathways where we're thinking about, if we protect a forest, does that get to count as negative carbon if that was already there? And on the technological side, often I work a lot on direct air capture taking emissions that are out there well mixed in the atmosphere versus carbon capture and storage, which is trying to take carbon dioxide, again, from kind of from a flume, so whether from a power plant smokestack or from a chemical process that is intensive in it. And I think it sounds wonky that we need to differentiate these, removals from these, preventions of emissions, but for the accounting, for the policy making, and especially for keeping on track and making sure that, folks who are making claims about what they're doing on climate are actually following through with them. That is a really important distinction, and that kind of, cross-cuts all of these pathways.
You got one, Will?
Yeah. I don't know if it's a misconception as much as a sentiment that I worry about, which is if any of these approaches have any risks, and all of them do, and we've talked about a bunch of them, that there's a segment of the community, and I fear it includes non-governmental organizations, that we shouldn't do it because there's a risk, right? And we really at this point need kind of risk trade-off characterizations, right? Because there's a massive risk of unchecked climate change, right? And so what that means at this point is, again, because we didn't get our crap together when I was young, there's no free lunch, right? Everything is going to have some risk, and what we have to do as a society is try to characterize that risk as accurately as we can, right? Try to minimize that risk as much as we can, and talk as a society about what kind of risk we're willing to incur, and how we protect the most vulnerable in our society given those kind of risks, right? But trying to take a position that if any of these things that we're talking about could have any harm whatsoever, we discount them, is not a rational way of looking at climate policy making, in my opinion.
Thanks for that. I think the thing that I come across most frequently actually has to do with, again, the way that we talk up here, which has to do with this sometimes conflation of how we think aspirationally about CDR and our readiness to do CDR and where we are right now. So it's important to remember how we are really in kind of we're just learning to walk, right, in this journey with CDR. And that's true on the science side and the technology side and the engineering side, on all of these sides right now. And so the way I think about this is to remind people of that there's an urgency that's not just around deployment at scale, and we may not get to that point, but that is about there's an urgency around this learning and around the trying, and to sort of putting forth our ability to actually, as scientists and as folks who are in the technology space and in the policy space, just putting it out there as quickly as we can so we can learn as much as we possibly can as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to give you all one final thing, and I'm going to give it to them and then let them think, and then I'm going to give you all some closing thoughts, which is I want you to think of what's that one question that you wish you had the answer to right now. So your question. While they're thinking about that, can I get those slides back up real quick? We have a survey about us in the series. I think you all know that feedback is really important to the Institute. I don't know if that's it, or that's it, or that's it. Do you mean stop clicking? Because you guys did it. I'll stop. This is what the team does, stop doing things. They tell me all the time. Please give us your feedback. Take the survey. Pull your phones out. Everyone knows how QR codes work. Thank you. While you're doing that, the museum's open. You hear kids laughing and playing and running through this awesome building. We have an amazing 7.5-year-old attending today's session because she's our future and she wants to learn about carbon removal. Thanks, Hazel, for being here. But that just goes to Will's point about needing to not just make decisions and actions today, because obviously we all care about the future generations in this building and sitting in this room. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm going to have my panel answer that. What's that one question that you wish you had the answer to today?
I'll start. The big question that I have very often, it's kind of practical, which is there a future where we have carbon markets? And are they voluntary or compliance markets? Or do we have a future where we have governments stepping in and just thinking about mandating some carbon removal without a market-based mechanism? And I think this is a really important question for me personally in terms of how we think about our business model at Seaworthy, which is who are we building quantification tools for? Are we building them for market participants, or are we building them for more government and policy participants?
That was essentially also my question. Carbon markets have been super useful. They also come with significant constraints. if we could move past the assumption that this all happens in the context of a carbon market, what could we imagine in terms of public support for getting this stuff off the ground?
Yeah, so earlier in one of my answers, I said that the bulk of the funding is still moving toward traditional climate solutions, and that's kind of how we should continue. And I came into this field thinking that what is often called the moral hazard of carbon dioxide removal, which is to say, if you present policymakers, present industry, present the public with the option of removing emissions after the fact, their willingness to prevent those emissions in the first place will be lowered. And there is complex and contradictory social science about how this happens and whether this happens at all. And so while we're still seeing the bulk of the funding going toward energy efficiency and renewable energy and all of these other things, we don't have a crystal ball to see what the counterfactual would be for policymakers, industry, the public, and how ambitious they would be about climate change if they didn't know about carbon dioxide removal. So one of the other things that we've done up here is to just continue to repeat carbon dioxide removal is not a silver bullet. It doesn't work without mitigation. That's a science communication tool that is true. It's not that we're using it frivolously, but that is being used intentionally in order to try and address some of those moral hazard concerns. And a question that I have is maybe the funding is still working out such that the majority is going toward the things that are most cost efficient in the near term. But how can we continue to elevate that urgency around acting on climate and make CDR a tool for increasing rather than leveling out or decreasing that urgency? And I think that is a very real open question and one that hopefully we can all think about together.
Yeah, it's just fascinating that we all kind of end up in the same place, right? Because for me, the question is, how do we effectively communicate this to the public, given the fact that the public has a lot of things to think about? And something I said in the first solar radiation management panel, we have politicians who actively propagate the theme that ignorance of science is a badge of honor, right? How do we get past that and get the public to think about this? Because ultimately, if we're going to do carbon removal at scale, it could cost us trillions of dollars, right? And it may be money well spent, right? But the public in any democratic system has to decide if we should expend those funds, or at least they should have a substantial role in how we expend those funds. And unless we can effectively communicate why we think it's necessary, what the trade-offs are, what values are most important, and get the public to provide their take on this, right? We've really failed, right? It can't just be technocracy driven and science driven, but it's very difficult to cut through the miasma of all the things that we as the public have to think about, right, in a day-to-day environment.
Thank you. Everyone join me in thanking this panel. Thank you all for being here today. Like I alluded to, there'll be a part 3. I'm looking at 2 of my guests sitting right here, which will have a strong focus on what's happening here in our own backyard in the state of Colorado. End of July, we got 2 dates in works. You'll hear about them soon. But you can pencil in July 29th or 31st on your calendar if you're really excited to pencil in something ahead. Thank you. Enjoy yourself. There's some food and coffee left, and we have this little space for a little bit. But obviously, enjoy the rest of your day and week ahead. Thank you.